I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today we speak about training therapists to work with eco-anxiety and training the public to self-regulate in stressful circumstances with author and therapist Leslie Davenport. Something with you. I am already so far past what my expectations were for this interview. Thank you so much, and I can't wait. I want to hear about it. So let me start up the official welcome. And so I am very pleased to have as my guest today on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, Leslie Davenport. And I didn't know Leslie Davenport before our call just a few minutes ago, meeting sort of face-to-face here in the ethers. But I did have a chance to read an article that she had posted in one of the, actually it's one of the very few professional oriented, collapse aware and resilience aware websites and groups, associations that I'm aware of really anywhere. And that's thanks to Bob Doppelt's work in transformational resilience and all he's done to create those alliances and various conferences and so on. And one of those is where I happened to bump into Leslie's article. And Leslie, you're a practicing psychotherapist and have been at this a while, evidently working in a couple of universities in training that very field. And I'd love to ask you to introduce yourself in those ways to let folks know what brings you to this conversation that way. What we're going to quickly, as we both discovered here, we're going to quickly land in how the entire field of psychotherapy needs to transform further than it already has. In my judgment, as I was just sharing, it's been a little slow, maybe even a couple of decades slow in my judgment, to really come up to speed to address the scale of what we're looking at. But what I can tell you, the dear listeners and viewers of this podcast, I think we're in for some real treats here to find out what is actually being done by the likes of Leslie Davenport and others in the field of psychotherapy and mental health in general. And as she was just telling me, it looks like we have some remarkably custom designed tools coming our way in this episode of the Poetry of Predicament. Tools specifically designed for self-regulation in these extraordinary times. So Leslie, thank you so much for sitting through this long, not quite introduction, indirect introduction. And now if you would please say hello to the folks and please introduce yourself in the way that you'd like to be known. And off we go into this great conversation.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad to be connecting with the community that you're a part of.
Yeah.
And I'm going to try and do a super quick ramp up of how I got to be doing what I'm doing now. Given the place I am in my life, I've had multiple careers. And the very first one that still feels relevant is I have a master's degree in dance. And I'm mentioning it because the creativity and the stepping into the unknown and how to explore it, play with it, work with it, continues to influence how I do things. And I think creativity is going to be called upon in all of us with what's ahead. and along those lines, specifically the use of the imagination. I worked for 25 years as a psychotherapist in a hospital environment, working with people with life-threatening illnesses. And I consider that sort of a boot camp for much of what I've learned, because people will get a diagnosis with a particular prognosis that has unknowns built into it. And they have to come to terms with what's their relationship to that? What's their relationship to healing that, doing what they can? What's their relationship to acceptance? What's their relationship to the rest of who they are and the rest of their life? And how can they best be supported by an interdisciplinary view that includes the best of medical care, along with body work and intuitive healing. And I was lucky to be part of actually creating one of the earliest integrative medicine programs in a primary hospital environment. It's still going strong, happy to say.
May I ask where that was? Or that,
sure,
where that is?
yes. Up until a year and a half ago, I was in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's part of California Pacific Medical Center. It's called the Institute for Health and Healing. And they have these satellite clinics now in a variety of hospitals, but that's sort of the, what we call the mothership.
Okay.
Yes, and then this transition to climate psychology. For whatever reason, I've always been interested in ecology and the environments, and it has sort of been a lifelong independent study of mine. And so at some point about 10 years ago, there was not a singular event, but there was sort of this accumulation of information and studies that just really hit me. You know, that moment where my eyes got open to the severity and the real impact of what's happening in the climate and with the environment in a way that I just could never look at differently again. I mean, you know, it's becoming more and more known now. And like many people who have those kinds of moments, I was examining what can I do and what's the biggest impact I can make. And I continued to do a variety of things, but I started out with you know, signing petitions and being part of marches, and was part of a clean energy policy legislative effort in my local community, connected with other organizations, 350.org, Pachamama Alliance, you know, put my fingers out into creating community. And then two things sort of came together for me. One was being in the mental health field for as long as I have, 30 plus years. I was like, well, why is that part not being talked about more? Not only in terms of the impact of climate disasters, but there's so many themes built into our training, such as how do we confront denial? How can we help facilitate a conversation that's polarized and not have it be contentious? How can we support lifestyle change? So many things that are relevant to include a behavioral science, psychology lens to interdisciplinary conversations. Yeah. So things like we know, you know, a lot of people who are well acquainted know that a lot of effort goes into what's the best way of talking about it. Because if we kind of blast people with scary facts, it may be true, but it can sometimes have people disengage because they feel too overwhelmed. I can't do anything. They feel too small. Fear, it's just kind of built into us as a stress reaction to want to turn away. And yet if we don't have the facts clear enough, is it, you know, enough information getting out there in terms of how urgent all of this is? And it's become a very debated and nuanced conversation for things like that, based on what we know about human behavior. Mm-hmm. So I my involvement has since become sort of multiple levels. I do see people in my practice who are either coming to me directly because of that climate anxiety, climate grief, or it becomes a part of what we do. I also have a lot of efforts in the direction of training therapists and getting the mental health field much more on board. It has been a slow and difficult process that I'd be happy to talk more about, as well as trying to share these key perspectives with other organizations, nonprofits, and others working in the field to make sure that they're not working against themselves unknowingly in terms of things like communication.
Would you say that last sentence again in terms of?
Well, like the example I gave of, you know, it's not just as simple as put the facts out there and people will come to the table. You know, kind of like what Bill McKibben wrote about in, I think Oil and Honey was the book, where he said, I thought that, you know, if I just told people what was going on, we'd make the change and that would be that,
Yeah.
you know? And obviously, we know that's not the case. And even my work back in health psychology, not enough to just say, okay, stop smoking, you know, exercise more and meditate, and you'd be so much better off. It's not, doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I had the same Bill McKibben style experience with my little book, you know, tiny by comparison, but it's called The Impossible Conversation, Choosing Resilience and Reconnection at the End of Business as Usual. And I thought everybody would respond to this dire information, because I shared with them literally how I vetted the information and then walked them through the process. And I thought, well, geez, I'm even helping them, you know, have a fast track. And no.
Yes, yes. And, you know, I will also say, though, you never know the real impact. You know, it's like you're planting seeds and it'll gets picked up in certain places and spreads out in ways that you may not even be aware. So
yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for that context and that history. It's very impressive. I was sharing with you just before we started recording that I was already, in the few minutes that we had talked, I was already, my mind was blown by how relevant and far advanced your current efforts are than I was expecting to hear about. So I'm really beside myself that you're here talking with us, and I can't wait to hear what you've been up to and what you see out ahead. You know, and in a strange way, I'm actually very, very interested in what you hinted at, like, what did she mean that it isn't just an easy process to train therapists about this material? What could she be pointing at? That's been very much my experience at obviously a far less consequential level, but you know, in any case, the aspects of shadow and of resistance and of denial that are built into all of our systems.
yes,
This is, you know, easily the most important conversation that humanity's ever had to face.
yes,
And the scale of it cannot be overstated. Of course, we're going to run into these barriers, these, sometimes I call them a membrane of resistance. And so I'm curious, maybe that's a place to start, just because you did suggest that we might pull on that thread. So can you speak a little bit about what you meant by the occasional difficulty, or I'm not quite sure what you were saying about training therapists for this work?
yes, I'm happy to talk about it. Well, one thing I'll mention without spending too long on this, there's different levels of training and credentialing with mental health professions, and some have had more headway than others. Mine is as a marriage and family therapist. So it's a licensure track based on a master's degree and state testing and that sort of thing. And so my primary experience has been within that arena. So just to give you an example, when my book came out a couple years ago, which is a textbook for the mental health field, I offered to give a free continuing education talk at many of the local chapters that were within a reasonable driving distance from where I was living. And I probably reached out to about 8 of them. And 2 said yes, even though this was a free, they already have these meetings, just rotating the speakers. And the feedback I would get, either directly or indirectly, was, well, that's not really what we do. You're trying to bring politics into the therapy room, and that just doesn't match with supporting, what our clients are here for. And similarly, my profession has an annual conference, same kind of thing. And for 3 years, I've sent in a proposal to be a speaker, and for 3 years, I've gotten a rejection letter. And so there's, at this point, not even much openness to hearing about, even posing the questions about what our role might be. Even stepping back from me laying out possible competencies that are necessary. So it doesn't slow me down too much, in the sense that it is certainly discouraging, but I kind of went through a similar thing in the integrative medicine programs, because I started promoting it long before it was as common as it is now. And I know the same thing is happening, and I've seen breakthroughs in just even the last year and a half of it being so much more in the media, so more receptivity. But there's a long way to go. There is a long way to go.
May I just, I'm going to run the risk of kind of going down a too detailed rabbit hole, but I think folks will find some value. I know I will. I'm curious, is there a bridge between what seems to be a recent breakthrough? I'm saying recent, like in the last 5 to 10 years, particularly the last 5, in the trauma-informed organizations and trauma-informed care conversation. Does that give any kind of a bridge to your inclusion of these larger scale mental health concerns? And with that question, if you wouldn't mind starting, how do you talk about it? Like, what do you call it? I sometimes call it being collapse aware. I sometimes call it climate change, because that seems to be the only piece of jargon people can really connect with. I also call it collapse of Earth and human systems. These are some of the little ways that I summarize the topic. I'm curious, are there any terms that you use that seem to work well? And then secondarily, that bridging with the trauma awareness conversation.
Yes, I do think the trauma awareness is very helpful, because this is about trauma impacts. I don't know if it's flinging the doors wide open quite. Some of the bridges I found is there has been for a long time sort of a subspecialty in the mental health field called disaster mental health. But it's all about going on site following a disaster and being part of the response team. So I've tried a little bit to work off of that to grow the context of the increasing rate and severity, how many more people will be impacted, how we can have a more proactive perspective. Just like, again, in medicine, it's not only once a diagnosis or an injury has occurred, but how can we institute a more preventative and stretch out the continuum of care. So I've gone that direction. And I've also, I've tended to shape my language based on the audience as best I can as well. So, for example, some of these conference proposals or workshops are pretty gentle. They're like psychotherapy for a changing planet. I mean, they're like pretty mild, you know, but just how can we, as you said, every human institution has to do a re-examination of their practices through a sustainability lens, or however you want to describe it. Let me give you a really good example of ways that I actually believe our field is damaging the way it's practiced now. So a common thing when a client comes into a therapist's office is the therapist will say, well, what are your goals? What are you hoping we can do? And let's say the client says, well, you know, I know I self-sabotage myself about work, and I want to be able to be more successful in my career and make more money and, you know, feel more confident. And I would say, well, if we're successful at this, what would it look like in 3 months and 6 months and a year? What would be different?
Yep.
Well, I could go skiing whenever I want. I could eat at the finest seafood restaurants. And that's how I know that I reached my goals. Well, you know, a statement like that to any climate-aware ears knows that there's a different level of self-sabotage if we just meet the client at that level, which is what therapists are trained to do. Yes. Unless, you know, it's defined as harm as we know it, you know, self-harm or abuse or etc. But right now that is not being defined as a form of harm, because we're not using a sustainability lens. So how could we add that, you know, well, you talked about self-sabotage, but, you know, I think, you know, you're following my line of thinking here. It's things like that, that I feel like we've got a long ways to go, but need to be addressed. At this point, I'm more just trying to get people to, for example, on my intake form, when people fill out why they want to be there, I've added a question that says, and when you hear about what's happening in the world, particularly climate change, how does it affect you? Because we're looking at stressors, right? We look at work stressors in home and illness and etc. And again, we help clients connect the dots of why they're having insomnia or why their anxiety is up, but we're not asking these questions yet for the most part.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for both of those pieces. Just another quick aside. You mentioned about disaster mental health, and it reminded me of a relatively small body of work by comparison to what you're talking about, but I think a substantial piece of work that a particular group has put together down in LA. It's a series of self-regulation practices that have been put together, and it basically, for exactly that kind of use, the disaster mental health kind of use. And that's the community resilience model from Elaine Miller-Karras. Does that ring a bell at all?
It doesn't, but I'm going to make a note and check it out.
You know, I would recommend it highly. You know, they've done a tremendous amount of work for therapists in particular. They call that side of the work the trauma resilience model.
Okay.
And they call the more lay level interventions, like the training of resilience skills to people on the ground right after an event and so on. They call that the community resilience model, or CRIM for short. And while we're talking, I'll look up the name of her book, which I always forget. But it's, I think it's an exceptionally useful and good fit with what the second piece that you've sent to me. And I don't know if it's too early in our conversation to talk about that.
Sure, no, I would be happy to. Let me introduce a concept that has to do with trauma in this work, and then resources and how to work with that. So one concept I think is essential to what we're talking about is something called the window of tolerance. Have you heard about this?
I have not.
So if it was a drawing, there's two parallel lines that are horizontal. And in between those two lines is what we would call the window of tolerance. So it means that in any particular day, the ups and downs, the stressors, the fun times, the excitement, the relaxation is kind of moving in a wave-like pattern in there. If the stress is too intense, if there's trauma, if there's too many things going on, we go outside of our window, and we either go, according to this chart, above it in a way that we're just reactive, we're already can't access our other parts of ourselves, so we might act out. Or depending on temperament, mostly, you can also dip under it, which is just, I'm going to check out. I'm going to isolate. I'm going to dissociate. I'm turned off. Anything you say doesn't go in my ears anymore.
Right.
Well, this window of tolerance, it expands and contracts. And the kinds of things that help it expand, where we can be present with more, are, first of all, simple things like good night's sleep. Like if you've had 3 nights when you're awake, there's just much less in you to say, let's have a difficult conversation, right?
No,
but
I am actually a monster on wheels after 3 nights of bad sleep. You're being far too polite, but I follow your track and keep going.
Yeah. Good food, all those really basic self-care kinds of things. But there's other things that can expand it as well. And that's what gets into this kind of self-regulation tools.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, mindfulness, yoga, the more meditative things are helpful for expanding the window of tolerance. Mm-hmm. Social connections, friendships. And I think it's really important for people to identify for themselves what those things are, because if it's yoga for one thing, it might be kickboxing for somebody else. It does
Mm-hmm.
not have to look the same. Art, music, whatever they are, but how those have to be a part of what we do so that we can be present with more. We are all going to have to be present with more. And so a way of understanding it is through this concept of building our window of tolerance.
Yeah, if I can refer back to that Elaine Miller Karras work that I was just mentioning, which I found the book title, by the way, it's Building Resilience to Trauma. And I'm going to put this on the screen, and I'll also put this in the show notes after our conversation here. And she would call that the resilience zone. That zone, that exactly the same model that you're talking about, just different jargon.
Yep.
And the idea being, yes, expanding our zone or our window of tolerance. And particularly, I'm not a big fan of clinical language, so it's a little difficult for me to say this, but the idea that we get knocked out of that zone or that window, and we really, the skill set that's required is how can we get ourselves back there and then eventually expand that space of where we can be resilient, we can return to a sense of humor, we can return to a sense of having our wits about us, being present in the face of large-scale stressors, rather than being the clinical term that I was mentioning, dysregulated.
Yes.
Another kind of dry way of saying I've been knocked off track. I've been knocked, my capacity has been greatly compressed. How do I get back?
Yes. Yes. Beautifully said. And I want to introduce kind of a secondary notion that fits in with this, which is, and again, very simple language. So we're using, and this one is 3 concentric circles. So we're used to thinking of our comfort zone, things that we do where we just stay calm and easy and familiar. Then there's what gets called the stretch zone, trying something new, maybe not 100% comfortable, going to some rally or whatever it might be, or writing or calling, whatever in the environmental work, let's say.
Mhm.
And then beyond that's the panic zone. So that would be another way of talking about it. You know, we don't want to go into the panic zone, but part of expanding that zone of resilience or that window of tolerance is being willing to go into our stretch zone. And in bits and pieces, perhaps in small steps, you know, practicing being able to be present with discomfort.
Yep.
Be present with more and not just kind of running for comfort. We have to know when to do that, and that there's kind of an art and a timing to it, but we also need to be willing to stretch in order to do this.
Right. Well, I'm very excited that we're having this conversation, and so glad to know that they're, you know, really my primary source for this whole body of work of building the skills of resilience and self-regulation has been through my conversations with Elaine Miller-Karras and a few others. I have, just for folks who are watching this podcast, there are a few episodes of prior interviews with Elaine and a few other providers of both at the program level and at the individual reading a book level, how to do the expansion that Leslie's talking about here. So I'm very excited to know about the work that you're doing in this same arena. Could you say a little bit more about that preliminary document you sent over, and is that something that I could suggest that people could find a link for? Can I include that link
Yes.
in our notes?
Absolutely. So one thing that I've done with a small group of therapists in my area, I'm currently living up near Seattle, is we've created what we're calling an emotional resiliency toolkit for climate work.
Yeah.
So this is a free, can be massively distributed, anyone can have access to it. It's in a PDF format. And the idea is that there are practices that build this kind of emotional resiliency we're talking about that last anywhere from 5 minutes to 15 minutes, does not require a mental health practitioner to facilitate. Very simple instructions. Some are well suited to groups. Many can also be done just by an individual. And our recommendation is that any kind of climate meeting, whether it's governmental, whether it's nonprofit, advocacy groups, begin to incorporate in every meeting 5 to 15 minutes so that this emotional intelligence, this resiliency work is going hand in hand with the action, so that there's inner strategies matching the outer strategies, because that is part of what's been missing. It's part of what leads to burnout. So this current first edition is just being released now. It has about 20 practices, and our aim is we're going to keep adding to it over the year and updating it with the goal of having 100 practices within a year. The way to check for updates is on my own website, which is lesliedavenport.com. There's a tab for climate psychology, and it's the one I sent you is currently there. And each time it's updated, I'm going to put an updated version on the site. And it's going to likely be on multiple sites as well, but I can guarantee that one for now.
Great. Well, I'll be sure that those links are both on the screen while you're talking and then also in the show notes here. Thank you for that. I got to tell you how, excuse me, how important that kind of accessible toolkit is. That's what I've been really, that's why I didn't become a therapist, to tell you the truth, because the vast majority of what I did a lot of high intensity work, training adults to work with troubled teens for decades. I knew that kind of deep and very intense work was designed for professionals in a safe environment. That just needed to happen. But back from there, what had community after community around the world be plagued by disempowered youth who were just as likely to tear the community down as anything, given how they're raised and how the community functions, and that there needed to be some kind of accessible toolkits for communities to be able
Yes.
to have some kind of empowerment, some sense of agency. And at a time, really, my entire lifetime has been full of examples of communities being eviscerated because they just literally didn't know any other way to be. There was
Yeah.
no sense of agency within reach for anyone. So
Yes.
I'm thrilled. And now, obviously we're at an existential level, a global level, not just a community level.
Yeah.
So it's more needed than ever. So thank you to you and whoever else has been involved with that project. And, we just all need to be stepping up and providing what we can. And that's a very needed piece.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And I'm glad, like, for example, through this conversation that it's helped getting it out there too. Tools are only useful if they're picked up and applied. So glad for this opportunity to let people know.
Yeah. So I would say my estimate is that we are on the kind of the wrapping up phase of this particular episode of our conversation. And I'm just going to break it to you right now. I would love to, after we sign off from this recording, I'd love to book whenever you'd like to do the next episode of this conversation.
Okay.
I would say that there are other layers to go. If you're willing, I'm thrilled, and we'll set that up. So we'll hash that out at the end.
Okay.
I'm curious if you could share with us what a bit more of what you see as you look at the development of this particular variant of mental health work, where you're inspired about what's going on and where you're particularly concerned about how things are perhaps not going in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
I would appreciate your view of both of those, because I think you have a fairly informed view, certainly compared to myself and many of our viewers. So what do you
Yes. Well, I think I'm encouraged, or I might even dare to say have a bit of hope in the recent escalation of awareness. Because, again, as I was saying, with things like eco-anxiety becoming so prevalent in the media, it's going to, when we were back at the hospital, changing the minds of hospital administration and doctors, as much as my efforts had something to do with it and research papers, it was the patients educating their doctors that made a huge difference. And so the fact that it's becoming so much more of an explicit conversation, that besides me trying to get the therapists on board, the fact that people are going to walk into therapy offices and say, I want to talk about what I'm feeling because of what's happening in our world, is going to also help get the therapists on board. For anyone who debates, is this government needs to be government run? Is it individual efforts? Is it, various professionals? The answer, of course, is yes, 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 and yes. Everything's connected. So I am encouraged that there's going to be an uptick in therapists' openness to it and pressure that they need to look at it, because it's, in a way, it's sort of mirroring the general population, because therapists are people too, right? And they struggle. I have very good friends who are colleagues who struggle with these conversations in spite of being trained in all these tools. So, you know, they're having to come to grips with this as individuals as well as the profession.
Yeah.
And I am encouraged again that the conversation is accelerating, the awareness is accelerating, that it will roll out from clients up as well as across the professional field.
Okay. Is that the answer to both, or is that just the part that inspires you?
Well, you know, my worry that I think is similar to our larger dilemma is, you know, the flip side of the same thing I said, the timing. Is there a way to get this to happen faster?
Yeah.
You know, it's always been the therapist model to kind of have the art of when a client is ready to discover something, we're supporting them, but it's kind of on their own timing. And there's a part of me that, while I still abide by the ethics of my field, feels like we don't have time for that anymore. You know, and so there's kind of this built-in dilemma of what to do with the necessity and urgency, along with what's possible with how we're assembled and because our psychology and our nervous system, of course, it goes back in time. The reason we tune out when we're afraid is programmed into us from way, way, way back when, all of those defense mechanisms and all of those stress reactions that we're familiar with. So there's not an easy answer, but I'm willing to stay kind of in the middle of the question and look for those openings and ways in.
I was looking at the same questions for myself while you were speaking, and truthfully, I am borderline cynical at this point, given I keep myself fairly aware of various metrics, and climate change is just one tiny fragment of what I keep track of, and it's not looking good in any aspect of the conversation. On top of that, I just want to mention something, and just perhaps this is planting a seed for future conversations. There are large chunks, if we could imagine all the different metrics that I'm talking about, if it's species extinction, if it's habitat destruction, if it's the fragility of the global economic system, and on it goes in terms of Earth and human systems to be measured.
Yes.
There are aspects of it that it feels like we're still a long way from including, that are the kind of thing that can really pierce my heart. And by that I mean, I look at someone as deeply courageous and as breathtakingly inspirational as Greta Thunberg in terms of the climate conversation.
Yeah.
And I look at our culture, our acceptable cultural ways of expressing ourselves and communicating with one another that include really implied violence.
Yes.
She gets trolled and she gets death threats, and we've normalized that. We've normalized a deep pathology that looks to me to be really a death wish for us all. I don't know how else to, I'm certainly not a professional to put it in any kind of clinical terms, but it looks dire to me when I look at that level, that we've allowed ourselves to get to this way of communicating about life itself and about a child who is standing for life, and we threaten her with death. So I don't mean to bring, actually I do mean to bring a deep level of sobriety and actually rattle us both a little bit, and rattle perhaps folks who are viewing for later conversations. For me, this conversation is not kidding around.
Yes, no,
please, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, just I appreciate what you're raising, and I do not have a perspective to talk you out of what you have said by
Yeah.
any. I think what I personally try and do and encourage others to do, and again, I'm in a way, I'm borrowing this from my health psychology work when there's a life-threatening diagnosis that has a lot of science behind it, is that there's also, there's several things. There's an element of an unknown. I have also seen people well outlive their reasonable diagnosis.
Yeah.
There's the question of what to do with what we have, in terms of length of time, quality of time, how to kind of, no matter what, look at what our own values are and make room for, you know, the unknown. I don't have any argument at all with what you're pointing to in terms of projections at all. But I do like to make room for the not knowing.
Sure. Yes. I hear you. I hear
Yeah.
you. It's a great tempering of that kind of big rock that I just threw into the space. And I thank you for that.
Because it's, let me just add one more thing. It's also part of our nature to want to land, you know? So sometimes it eases our distress to land on either business as usual or doom.
Sure.
And that's not, again, to deny what you pointed to, but the part of it's a bigger psychological challenge to stay in the middle, to stay in the action, in the movement, in the unfolding.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, boy, I know that we could just pull this thread for hours. I just know it. And again, Leslie, I just thank you so much for going so far beyond my hopes and expectations for this conversation. I had no idea how it would show up, how you would show up. And I so appreciate the obvious care and passion that you brought to this for quite a long time. And that's deeply reassuring to me. And then you mentioned that you're in working with others in kind of team fashion to produce these tools and support elements. And again, I thank you all, and I hope you will pass on my appreciation. And I'm sincere when I'm saying it would be extraordinarily valuable if we could make this a regular occurrence. These are conversations that don't get had nearly enough.
Thank you so much, and I'd be very happy to come back and continue this.
Yeah. If I could ask you to just hang on for a couple of moments after we sign off here. But once again, just thank you. And we'll push the official turn off the recorder button and off we go. Thank you all for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.